This week, Africa insisted that when it comes to cartography, size really does matter.
There's a very tangible link between the map and perception, because undermining and showing a reduced continent and a smaller continent very much undermines also that false perception of importance and power on the global stage.
Farah Anjai, the co-founder of Speak Up Africa, speaking to Reuters on Saturday. Arion, what's the story?
So this week, the African Union, which represents the interests of 55 African countries, has endorsed a campaign to have organizations around the world replace the map of the globe that we're all familiar with, which is known as the Mercator projection, with alternatives such as the 2018 Equal Earth map, which supporters say just more accurately represents the true size of Africa. And in the Equal Earth map, for example, Africa, when shown in its true proportions, dwarfs Europe, which the map that we're used to seeing doesn't do. And South America is much bigger than we're used to seeing it as well. And this may sound like a trivial tweak, but supporters say that that kind of a change fundamentally shifts our understanding of the world.
Yeah, I saw one of the people representing Africa No Filter, which is another organisation backing this plan, Felicity, describe the Mercator map, the map that shows Africa as smaller than it actually is, as being, quote, the world's longest misinformation campaign. Do you have some sympathy for that?
I mean, it's hard to get away from the fact that it is inaccurate, and it is kind of mind-blowing when you actually see the true sizes of some of the territories, particularly Greenland. I must admit, I fell into the same camp as Donald Trump in not realizing that Greenland is actually much smaller than it appears on the map. Greenland looks absolutely huge. It looks about the same size as Africa, and it's not even a tenth as big. So it did kind of blow my mind. It is inaccurate, but I think the reasons for why it looks the way it is maybe more innocent than, realised. It came into being by a Flemish cartographer who was Gerardus Mercator, it was a navigation tool basically that he was trying to make it easier for sailors to navigate. And I mean, anytime you're trying to put a 3D sphere globe onto a 2D projection, there's always going to be inaccuracies. So it's definitely inaccurate, but I don't think I don't think he was trying to set out to diminish Africa.
Sure, but Rebecca, does it matter whatever the intentions of Mercator were in 1569? I mean, it does seem reasonable to say we're in 2025 now, we should have an accurate map. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're, saying that the old map was a bad thing.
The thing is, of course, there's no way, as Felicity was saying, there's not really a way to have an accurate map. Whenever you're doing a flat map of a spherical object like the Earth, there always have to be compromises. And in Mercator's case, it comes down to what maps are for. In Mercator's case, he was making a map for sailors. The important thing was that you could navigate based on the map. The reason that became popular was that it showed the room lines. Those are the lines that you'd follow if you kept your compass pointing in the same direction. And in reality, those lines curl around the Earth, but Mercator's projection made them appear straight. That made them more valuable to sailors than scale. If you know the shape of Australia and how to steer to it or around it, the question of how it compares in size to Greenland is pretty abstract. But there's certainly an argument to be made that today we are living in a world where obviously people do still rely on maps for navigation, but the majority of people who are looking at a flat map, say on a classroom wall or on a browser screen, are not looking at it because they're trying to navigate from one side of the Earth to the other, and that there is potentially more value in a map that shows land proportionate to its size than it is in one that you could follow with a compass.
Yeah, and that distinction's worth making still, isn't it, Arion? People who are using maps for navigation are still using maps based on Mercator, remarkably, even though it is hundreds of years old. Whereas the ones that are going to be on a classroom wall, that's where the argument is. It disproportionately skews land masses.
I think that's right. And the idea that the African Union is driving at by accepting this to take up this campaign is that they're trying to redress the idea of map bias. So by putting these maps into classrooms and places where we're used to looking at what the world ought to look like, that will help to offset the fact that by, enlarging Europe and North America and placing them prominently while shrinking regions like Africa and South America and Southeast Asia and so on, kind of skews perceptions of importance and power. And there have actually been studies that show that humans naturally associate size with significance. That's fairly obvious when you sort of think about it. But that's led many people, even school children, to kind of overestimate the prominence of Western nations and think that places like Africa are consequently less important. And so there was this one fascinating test that was done by Thomas Saarinen, who's a geographer who did map studies in the 1980s and 90s. And he'd get people to do a sketch map from their brain to try to remember what the world looks like without actually looking at a map. Yeah. And lots of people would tend to put their own country at the center of that map, obviously, and then draw the rest of the world around it. But for many people who had grown up in places that used to be part of European colonies, they'd often put just the Mercator map up, that they were really influenced by this old projection of what it used to look like and all of the power dynamics that came with that. So there is this kind of subtle thing that goes into our heads, and that's what the word map bias is all about. And that's the thing that the African Union is trying to undo here.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, Felicity? Because if I did that exercise, if I drew the map from memory, of course, Europe is at the centre of it. I mean, actually, that doesn't really change from an African perspective because therefore Africa is also at the centre of it as it happens. But the point is, on a globe, whether we're talking about disproportionate lines and things being stretched or whatever, the centre isn't really a thing either when you make it two-dimensional. Why is Europe and Africa always at the centre of it? It could just as easily be North and South America, or it could just as easily be Russia, but it isn't.
True, but I guess that also goes back to the fact that Mercator was Flemish, right? So presumably that's also how, I might be wrong, I'm totally making this up, but isn't that how you see the most amount of countries on a 2D bit of paper, is to have Europe and Africa kind of in the middle?
Oh, because of oceans and things. Yeah. The Australian is shaking his head.
Oh, well, no, I've seen all of these weird and fascinating maps. There's this Chinese map which puts the South Pole roughly in the middle of the map, and that gets China into the top middle, and that the result is that all the other land masses then kind of emanate out of it. And the weirdest one I saw is this Australian map that flips the whole globe upside down and then obviously puts Australia in the middle of the map. And it's a subversive effort to make North America and Europe look like afterthoughts. So there are totally different ways that you can arrange the Earth, and we just have this sense that Mercator is the right one.
Although, of course, I mean, most people, when they think of maps these days, I would argue, Rebecca, are thinking about Google Maps. So that changes everything anyway, doesn't it? I'm just back from my holidays. We sailed from Portsmouth to St. Malo. I was on the boat showing the kids where we were. First thing you do is open up Google Maps, zoom in, and to try and make sense of the direction the boat's going, you tilt Britain round so it's in the south. And you're heading to France, which is north, and you suddenly everything looks really different. You think, God, France is massive.
Yeah, and Google has switched. Google Maps now uses the Equal Earth map rather than the Mercator one on the browser version, although the app still uses the Mercator version. I'm not quite clear why. I couldn't quite get to the bottom of it, but I think it probably comes down to aesthetics as much as anything else. Google wants to offer something to its users that they are familiar with that's not going to alienate them. I expect that they will switch over eventually, though. The World Bank is also in the process of switching over, and I think it will become the default. I mean, the thing that has slowed down acceptance of some of the alternative maps proposed in the past has often been just purely aesthetic. One of the more popular alternatives is the Gould-Peters map. It's based on one that was developed in the 1850s, then it was sort of rediscovered, reinvented in the 1970s on a wave of anti-colonial feeling, and that did offer a much more proportionally correct distribution of the Earth's land masses, but it visually distorted it in a way that was not only inaccurate, because again, you always have to sacrifice something, and so if you look at Gould-Peters map, Africa looks really long and weird. What it actually looks like, the whole map looks like you downloaded something in the wrong dimensions and then you uploaded it and you're like, oh, it's all stretched. It looks really stupid and weird now. So there's just something about that map that's always looked a bit wrong. And in fact, the Equal Earth map, the one that the African Union has thrown its weight behind now, was developed in response to some schools deciding to adopt the Gould-Peters map as a more accurate alternative to the Mercator. It's like these people saw them adopting this map that visually looks really horrible. I'm like, we have to come up with something different that looks much better. And the Equal Earth one uses curved edges, and the projection is more sort of splayed in a way more reminiscent of a globe, which enables it to both be more accurate to the proportionate size of the countries, but also retain a more sort of pleasing shape.
Okay, but why does any of this matter, really? I mean, Felicity, the argument, I guess, that the organisations that back this are making is that this will help African countries sort of feel themselves, basically. Look how big and important we are, and it will help the other countries around the world come to that conclusion as well. But geographic reality doesn't have anything to do with politics and corruption and economy and investment and all those sorts of things that actually make a difference to how a nation performs.
Yeah, I'm slightly dubious and skeptical as how this will massively make a difference. I think when you look at a map of Africa, what is more striking and more egregious is really how Africa was carved up, and how where the territories of different countries lie was basically concocted by Europeans in the 1800s, mostly at the 1884 Berlin Conference between the Germans and the Brits. And it was all part of the scramble for Africa. It was a lot of imperial nations just dividing it up willy-nilly with no kind of thought to different ethnicities or different, how the people who actually live there, how their territories should work. And that has caused, issues that go on and on and on right up until the present day. And one of the most fascinating is the Caprivi strip in Namibia, which if you look at a map of Namibia is this very, very tiny, long, thin panhandle strip, which is very, very odd. And the whole idea was that the Germans agreed with the Brits that they needed this strip to connect two of their territories. They got thwarted by the Victoria Falls. I mean, they hadn't even been to the area and they didn't know the Victoria Falls was there, which was going to be massively in their way. But all these sort of random territories and lines were put in place by Europeans, and it explains things like the Rwandan genocide between the Tutsis and Hutus. So when I saw the story, when I actually look at a map of Africa, it's more the kind of completely arbitrary lines and boundaries that I think have been a bigger stumbling block for Africa achieving the economic prowess that it could do.
Arion.
Oh, I mean, I think there's truth to that, and there's so many problems that can be drawn from European engagement with the continent of Africa broadly. But I think this is kind of low-hanging fruit for the African Union, which has formally declared 2025 to be its year of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. And that is an initiative that's intended to try to address all of those ongoing injustices that have stemmed from the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism and apartheid. And of course, you can't undo those lines between countries now that those have been drawn without, again, causing loads more wars. But this is a thing that you actually can do fairly easily. There was an internal memo that was seen by the New York Times where the African Union said that the push for a new map sat perfectly with this 2025 theme. And the organisers felt that the map campaign is kind of perfect in how it pushes back at misleading narratives about the continent and supports efforts to restore Africa's position on the global stage. So, some things it's going to be very hard to undo, but this is one that you could fairly easily undo without too much effort, with literally a stroke of the pen. And so that seems like just a sort of natural progression, considering its simplicity.
And Rebecca, Felicity made a reference earlier to Donald Trump's impressions of Greenland, perhaps having been skewed by its relative size on the Mercator map. Is there a possibility that this is coming to a head now so that Africa can influence Donald Trump and say, look how big and important we are, and or organisations can say, look how relatively small Canada and Greenland are, stop trying to buy them? I mean, is that actually realistic?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a lot of symbolism in maps. So this is sort of what we've been getting at through this whole topic, is that when there is no such thing as an accurate 2D representation of Earth, any time that you try and create one, you are communicating your own priorities, your own biases. I mean, even Mercator's map had lots of limitations in that respect. He was mostly just doing the edges of countries, because this was a time when people didn't know what the interior of most of Africa and Asia and South America looked like. I mean, to be fair, his depiction also included some things that I don't think we should be putting on any maps that go in front front of Donald Trump, like giants and sea monsters, lots of text boxes with Mercator's sort of quaint speculations about what might be in different countries. It was quite charming, but yeah, probably not something you want to hang on a classroom wall.